this scene is just a very simple fictional tissue. Maybe these are tissue projections. And so it's just a silly little scene, very simple geometry. And as always, we have the shot cam in the scene so we can look through it. Either panels look through selected, or we could go panels, perspective, shot cam. And what I want to do here is we're going to aim for a look that's kind of like an endoscopic view. So I've pulled up a reference of a colon endoscopy. So if you're somehow that grosses you out, then avert your eyes. But basically, we've got basically I want to simulate this kind of both the lighting setup and the texture, the material, the shader, the whole look of it all together. So we're going to develop this look in our scene here. And the best thing to do when you're starting is to really take a detailed look at the different things that are going on. So if we think about the lighting for this scene, first of all, it's really quite simple, because all it is there's one single light source. Clearly there's not a whole array of fluorescent lights inside the colon, but there's just one light source that is situated at the same point of view as the camera, because that's how an endoscope works. So we know where the light's going to be. We know that it's a simple lighting setup. And how about the material, the texture? So this tissue has kind of a soft, translucent quality to it. We talked about subsurface scattering before, and the idea that light can go partially through material, bounce around, and come back out. And I think that's partly what's going on here. The human tissue has a kind of a translucent quality, which you can see if you hold your hand up against a light, or if you put a flashlight in your cheek or something silly like that. We also see that we've got these specular highlights, these sort of speckled, spotted specular highlights, which really are one of the main features that make this look like a wet environment, right? This kind of moist texture to it. And we also have this kind of spidery, veiny texture to it as well, little blood vessels and all of that. So we're going to try to achieve all of that without painting any textures. We're just going to be using Maya's built-in procedural nodes to get as close as we can to that. It's worth mentioning that creating organic tissue is a hard thing to do. In most cases, it's a lot simpler to create something man-made like a plastic or a metal or other objects, and that's just simply because there's so much more going on with human tissue. There's so many more layers, there's so many more different cell types and things happening here. So one of the key aspects of this is just layering things up, adding different kinds of variation, thinking about the sorts of layers and the surfaces that are on these kinds of tissues. Okay, so we're going to create a new panel layout, and in this case I want to actually put the hypergraph inside the main window as opposed to a floating window, just for a bit of convenience. So under panels, saved layouts, I'm going to choose the perspective hypergraph outliner, which is this one here, hypershade outliner perspective. And so we'll load that panel layout, and I'm going to make the outliner a lot smaller. And the other way to get to it is if you hold down spacebar to get the hot box and you right click above the right click above, or even left click above, I think. Yeah, left click above the hot box, you get this marquee menu to choose the panel layouts, and we choose the hypershade outliner perspective. And if you prefer to work with floating windows, you can pull up floating windows as well. So I'm going to reduce the complexity of the hypergraph here a little bit. I don't really want this property editor because we've got the attribute editor already here. So I'm going to close that. And I'm going to, let's see here. We've got a lot of of stuff in the hypershade, and this is kind of left over from a previous scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on, let me just make sure that I've opened up the right, okay, good. I'm going to right click on the object itself and assign Lambert 1 just to make sure that we've got Lambert 1 on it. And then I just want to delete everything that's not being used here. And there's a quick way to do that in the hypershade. You can go edit, delete unused nodes, and that's a good way to sort of clean up your scene if you're not using everything. And so I've just done that, edit, delete unused nodes, and that's cleared out a lot of different things. What's this one here? Atom shader? I don't know. Anyways, so I'm going to start by creating a Mila material. And so I can type Mila in this create filter, and I should get the Mila material here. Otherwise, I can come down to mental ray, and under materials, choose Mila material. Okay? And now that I've created that, that's really all I need to do with this create box. So I'm going to click the X to close that and give us a little bit more space, and as well as this bins panel, which we haven't really talked about, but I'm going to close that as well. So now we've got a bit more working space here. I can even expand it a little bit. And we can hit F to frame up on our current selected node if we want. Maybe adjust the layout of some of these nodes. And we've got our basic material. The other thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that this Mila material, new Mila material, is assigned to it. So we can do that a number of ways. We can just select our tissue geo in the outliner here, and we can right click on Mila material and choose assign material to selection. And there's a little bit of a brightening here, and that hopefully if we click on the tissue geo, yeah, we can see that this Mila material is available to us in the attribute editor. So I'll select that and call it, I don't know, something, tissue Mila material. I'm actually going to put the material viewer there. And nothing seems to be showing up in this mental ray material viewer, so I'm just going to try switching to hardware, and then back to mental ray, and maybe changing the environment as well. It still doesn't seem to be refreshing, but we'll just press on and hopefully it'll catch up to us. The Mila material is a special type of material, and it's built up in a specific kind of way. Instead of having all of the attributes available to us at the beginning, it starts us out with just a very simple base component. And as we talked about different components of materials, we can add those in and layer those in bit by bit. So I think Mila stands for mental images layered something. And so this is a layered material. So the base component, the diffuse, we could choose a number of different bases, but we're just going to leave this as diffuse. And for the color, we want to choose something that's just a healthy pinkish tissue sort of thing. Not super saturated, but something that is reminiscent of our reference here. But I'm just going to pick something here. Okay. Let's do a test render here. And before I do that, I want to check a couple of things. I want to make sure that our preset is set to 1080p, and that's okay. But if I'm having my render settings at 1080p, I want to make sure that my test resolution is a lot smaller. So I'm going to go to test resolution, and maybe 960 by 540, or even 480 by 270, just something that's a fair bit smaller, so that it doesn't take a super long time to render. So you notice what I did when I hit the render button. It's rendered out with the perspective view, not the shot cam view. So I want to make sure that I've got render shot cam, or clicking this clapperboard icon, render current frame. Okay, so we've got this base color, and I want to, at the beginning, set up some lighting information so that I can see how the material is working. Right now I have this default material, or the default light, and I don't want that. So I want to make sure I turn off the default light at the bottom of the render settings. Again, we're opening up the render settings with this clapperboard icon with the gear. And at the very bottom of the common tab, I also want to make sure that we're using mental ray, of course. So mental ray, and turn off enable default light. If I used Maya software, it's just going to come out black, partly because we have the default light turned off. But even if that was on, Maya doesn't know how to render the mental ray, the Mila material. So I want to make sure mental ray is selected. Okay, so normally with look development, I recommend using just a simple lighting setup like we talked about before, image-based lighting and a key light, or just a couple of lights with a 3-point setup. But because we have a very specific lighting setup, lighting and situation that we want to use, I think in this scenario it's okay to sort of develop those together. So we're gonna put in a single light here and work from there. So I'm gonna close the render viewer and the render settings. And in the perspective view, I can go panels perspective, and I'm just going to hit spacebar in that panel to get our full view. I'll go create lights, physical area light. And where are we going to situate this light? Well, we want to situate this exactly where our camera is. Now if we put it right in front of our camera, because this light, I think, is visible, we're actually going to see it. So we want to make sure that it's just a little bit behind the camera. And it's facing the wrong way, which you can see by the little line indicator. So we want to go into our rotate tool and flip it around. And we can make this a little bit bigger, and we could point it down a little bit since that's the direction our camera's facing. We don't want to make it too big because the endoscope light acts a little bit like almost a point source. It's probably a smallish light source. And because in the area light settings we've got a couple of these settings turned on, use light shape and visible, that means that it's actually going to use the size and shape of this light in order to both be visible in the reflections on the object, and also for the amount of and sort of the angle of light that's being cast. If we have a very large light, it's going to make very soft and diffuse shadows, whereas if you have a small light source, you're going to have harsher shadows. So that's something to think about when you're working with your lights. And because we've got an endoscope, I think that instead of a rectangular area light, we probably want to choose something like a disc. So now we've got a circular light source, and that's only really relevant because we've got the light shape being involved in the actual reflections. And I'm going to switch back to my shot cam, and I'll hit space just to get our original panel layout back, and I'll come up to the render viewer and I'll do another little test render. Okay, and again, because the intensity of the light has a quadratic fall off, we've got a very dim looking view. So I'm going to choose my area light in the outliner so we get back to those settings. And I'm going to change the intensity right up at the top to maybe something like 5,000. Give that a try. And again, the intensity really depends on how far away your light is. So depending on where you've put your light, it might be different. You might want to choose a different intensity. I might want to bump that up to something like 7,000, just make it a little bit brighter. Okay, so that's a good starting point for our light setup. You can see, again, the shadows are pretty much right behind the objects, and that's what we would expect if your camera and your light are pretty much in the same position. You can also see that the shadows are a little bit fuzzy and grainy. So the fuzziness or the softness of the shadows is fine, but the graininess is just because of the quality settings, which we can change after the fact. But we don't want to bump up our quality too much when we're just doing these little test renders. And I'll close the, even if I close the render viewer, if I open it back up, I should have access to those. In fact, we have access to all the other ones we were doing in the previous tutorial. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the Mila material. I mentioned that this has a single base component, and in order to add some other things to it, we're going to be adding new layers to it. And the Mila material, it's a relatively new material, and so it can be a little bit buggy. And so sometimes if you add in layers, I found, and then you kind of undo that, it doesn't always undo completely properly. So sometimes it's best to sort of save a scene and save them frequently. Okay, so the first sort of layer of texture that I want to add to this is going to be the veiny texture here. And we could do this a number of ways. I'm going to actually add this onto a new layer instead of piping it into our existing color. So I'll click plus layer, and then we're prompted with some options, whether we want to choose a weighted layer or a Fresnel layer or a custom layer. Fresnel layer, if you remember, the Fresnel effect has a different weight or a different effect depending on whether it's facing towards the camera or on the side, sort of perpendicular to the camera. But that's clearly not what we're, like this is clearly not a Fresnel effect. The veininess of the texture is equally visible regardless of where we're looking. So I'm going to choose weighted layer, and then we're provided with even more options. And so these should start looking a little familiar because we've got the different components that we talked about: specular reflection, glossy reflection, diffuse reflection, and then transmissions components, which are when light is passing through an object or into an object. We also have subsurface scattering and emission. So I'm going to choose the diffuse reflection because this is color information. This is going to be into a diffuse channel. So if we click on diffuse reflection, make sure to choose reflection and not transmission inadvertently. We get a new layer that's sitting on top of the old layer. And you can see our preview is completely gray. I'm going to make one more effort to try to get this material viewer responding. Okay, so now I've got the material viewer updating, and I'm going to clear out the graph here because this is getting a little cluttered. So I'm going to hit the sparkle icon, and I'm going to choose tissue again and regraph it in here. So this Mila material, the layers are actually situated in separate nodes. So if you'll notice, we've got what's called a Mila layer node, and that's controlling the layering of these different components. So we've got the diffuse reflection 2, which is the one we just added, and then our diffuse reflection 1, which was our base layer. And then we have each of those as separate nodes. So it's a little bit complicated here. Fortunately, we can access most of the parameters and properties that we want in the sort of the material node itself. So most of the time I'm going to have this tissue Mila material selected. You can see that this gray value is overriding completely our pinkish tissue value, and that's because the weight is set at 1. If I reduce the weight, then you can see that some of that color is coming through, and if we brought it all the way down to 0, then all of it goes through. So think about the Mila material as light strikes the surface, it's encountering these layers from top to bottom. And the weight is essentially how much of that energy is going towards that component. So if we had a specular reflection with a weight of 1, then all of the light striking that would be bouncing off with a specular reflection. But if it was the weight was 0.5, we can do the weight 0.5 here, then we can say that half of the light is bouncing off with this diffuse reflection with this color information, and the remainder of it is filtering down into the layers below. So think of this as sort of a top to bottom layering system. So to get our veiny texture, what I kind of want to do is I'm going to plug a procedural node into the color channel. So I'll bring this back up to 1 so we can clearly see what's happening here. And to plug something into the color, I'm going to click the checkerboard, the checker icon. And instead of choosing a 2D texture, I'm going to choose a 3D texture. Now, a 3D texture is very similar. These procedural textures are similar to 2D textures, except that they don't use UV information. Instead, they react with an object in a sort of in the 3D space, such that it's as though you've got this object is chiseled out of the material that you are using. So in this case, we're going to choose marble. And if I click on marble, what you can see is we've got this marbly texture on the shader ball and on our object down here. But the way that this is calculated is as though the marble, these veins in the marble, exist in 3D space. So it's not a 2D texture that's been wrapped around this object. It's being sort of applied through it. So I'm going to use this marble to try to simulate sort of veins. And there's a lot of different attributes that we can play with under these marble attributes and the noise attributes. The first thing we want to change is the color. So the filler color, I'm actually going to choose the same as our base color. And it should be the first swatch in this list here, because it keeps a history of the colors that you've chosen. So I'll choose that one. And then the vein color, let's pick something maybe a little bit sort of darker, darkish reddish brown. And we can come back to our reference and kind of imagine what color. We could even sample it with an eyedropper if we wanted to. Maybe something like that. And it's important to, the shader ball will give you a sense of the texture here, and the object in the viewport will also give you a sense of the texture here, but neither of them are going to give you a completely accurate view. It's important to do test renders to actually see how it's being applied to the object. So you can see that the render view actually is quite different, or it's a little bit different at least, from the viewport, and it's different from the shader ball. So thinking about the scale and how the material looks, you want to make sure that you're rendering things out. So I played around with these parameters for a little while, and I encourage you to play around with them yourself, but some of the values that I found to be working at least reasonably well are going to reduce the vein width by half, so down to 0.05. And you can see that that's changing and updating in the shader ball here. So I'm going to save this image here. I'm going to call this marble default. The diffusion is how much sort of bleed there is between the vein and the filler. So I'm going to put that up quite high. I'm going to choose something like 0.9. You can see it spreads out just a little bit. And likewise, the contrast I'm going to put quite low, maybe something like 0.025, so that this is much more diffuse, maybe 0.03, something like that. Okay, so that's a little bit more cloudy, kind of like my reference image. But the scale to me doesn't really seem right. Now, the place, instead of a place 2D texture node, we have a place 3D texture node. And the place 3D texture node kind of has the similar attributes to a regular transform node, and that defines how that volume, that 3D volume texture, is being applied in your scene. So in this case, I'm going to change the scale to something like 3, and you can see that that has changed both of these a lot, but as always, it's important to do a test render. So you can see this is kind of more feathery and more kind of a little bit more veiny in my opinion. The amplitude is the amount of perturbation that these veins go. I think they're a little too straight right now, so I'm going to double this value, put it up to 3, do another test render. So you can see that's a lot more sort of random noise looking thing. The ratio you can look in the documentation. I looked in the documentation to figure out what these different parameters were actually doing, because it's not always obvious what they're doing. So the ratio down, we could do it. I should probably be keeping these in here so we can actually see what's going on. Maybe that's a bit too much, so maybe put that back to 0.65 or something. Okay, something like that, and we can kind of go back and see how far we've come. And the ripples are sort of the movement in different directions. And what I feel like in our view, they're kind of stretched out. They're not sort of moving in all different directions. So I kind of want to stretch out this a little bit. So I'm going to change in the ripples Z, the last value here. I'm going to put that up to something like 5. And let's save this and do another test render. And now you can see that they're kind of stretched out in this direction. And maybe that's a little bit closer. Definitely this encourages a lot of experimentation and testing. And you can probably push this further and do different things. And sometimes you'll get stuff that just doesn't look any good at all, and you'll be sort of going backwards and forwards. So it's important to take note of the actual attributes that you're playing with. And my recommendation is to only make one change before you do a test render, because if you say, well, let's change the diffusion and the contrast and we'll change the ripples a little bit, and then you do another test render and it's kind of what you want but not quite, you're not going to know which of those values contributed to that change. So that's also why it's really important to keep your render times low. So if you're doing test renders where it takes 30 seconds or a minute to actually get any information, you're going to be banging your head against the wall. So another way that you can actually speed up your test renders is, instead of rendering the whole frame, you can just render a small part of the frame. And that's really easy to do. All you need to do is just drag a rectangle around the region that you want. And you'll see a red box. It's maybe a little hard to see, but there's a red box that defines that region. So maybe we've changed, let's say, the amplitude to something like 1. And see, well, what does that do? So instead of clicking the redo previous render, we just choose the next one, which is the render region. And so when we do that, then we're just rendering part of the frame. And so now you can clearly see the difference between that parameter, changing that parameter did. So I highly recommend work with a low resolution. You can even go lower, 480 by 720 or something like that. Keep your quality settings low, and also work with the test render or the render regions.